Thank you everyone for joining today. This was a relatively late addition to the program for the community course this year, but how could we not have Richard come on and talk all about the exciting stuff happening at bioRxiv, medRxiv, and OpenRxiv? It's a shame archives already been taken because I don't know how to group you all into one big thing, into the archives. I don't really need to give Richard much of an introduction, I don't think, for this crowd. So I'm just going to hand straight over and I'm going to stop talking because I'm about as excited as everyone else is to hear what you've got to say.
Okay, thanks, Johnny. I'll just share my screen. Assume everyone can see that now, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so what I'll do is, the collective name actually, Johnny, was coined by Ramin, and it's Starchive to describe all archives with an asterisk. That's what he suggested. So that's what we're going with. So what I was going to do was kind of do a bit of a sort of random walk through the past, present, and future to get to kind of the why of OpenRxiv and explain kind of how we got here and in some respects why OpenRxiv makes sense. And it occurred to me that maybe somebody on the I always assume that everybody knows the long history, but it's frequently pointed out to me that there are people who have not been in science since 2013. So it's probably good to go back to a little bit of the past. So I'll start with that, which was the start of bioRxiv in 2013. So this was inspired by arXiv in the computational science, physics, and math community, the idea that you could distribute papers without peer review immediately, but with some kind of screening to eliminate the crazy stuff. And so it was really an experiment to see whether this could be done in the biological sciences when a lot of people said it couldn't be, and there had been attempts in the past. So, we launched bioRxiv. It's a free non-profit service, and it was funded by Cold Spring Harbor Lab initially, and then Chan Zuckerberg Initiative got involved, as did the Sergey Brin Family Foundation, and now we have a number of institutional commitments as well. And if anybody wants to look more into that history of how bioRxiv started, because I don't have time now, there's a YouTube conversation that I had with Leonid Krugliak, who was a very early activist, and Prachya Vasti. So I would encourage people to look at that YouTube conversation if they want a more detailed history of that. Then fast forward 6 years, and we launched medRxiv with the idea that there would be sort of higher guardrails for the health sciences and clinical community, but much the same as bioRxiv, but focused on health and clinical papers. And this was a collaboration with Cold Spring Harbor, Yale, and BMJ, and Yale and BMJ brought in, immensely important clinical expertise, including Theo, who I think I just noticed is on this call. And as I said, slightly higher guardrails because of the risks of clinical information. So that was launched in 2019. And all these were really doing was to decouple the dissemination of work from its subsequent evaluation. Typically, that's by journals. So, we all know that the steps shown in gray there are the rather tortuous process of peer review, multiple rounds of revision and rejection that delays dissemination of work. And the idea is that if you could post it on a preprint server, then it would be available within 24 to 48 hours, ideally, rather than 7 months to a year, perhaps even as long as 5 years. So the real reason for this, goal number one, was to accelerate discovery. So if you disseminate all this information immediately, then people can begin to build on it immediately as well. And Steve Quake at the BioHub in San Francisco did some back of envelope calculations about, just rough estimates of how many discoveries follow on from new ideas. And if you make assumptions about things being delayed for a year by the journal peer review, you can rapidly get to an estimate that if everybody were to disseminate work immediately through a preprint server rather than only through journals a year later, that you could accelerate science fivefold over 10 years. So that was really goal number one for launching bioRxiv, just try and make this a reality in the biological sciences. And then goal number two was to stimulate evolution of the scientific communication system. So, traditionally, you would go from bioRxiv to journals, but the decoupling we talked about would allow experimentation and allow other things to happen. For example, studies of reproducibility, traditionally not taken by journals, would be available on a preprint server because there's no judgment of quality or impact or significance, for example. And then, there could be experiments in peer review, experiments in different form of commentary, etc. And we've seen a number of things like that. Plus, of course, discovery, because bioRxiv and medRxiv are indexed by places like Google Scholar. And we provide a big text and data mining repository for machine analysis of content independently of the main websites, which are for human readers. This all started at Cold Spring Harbor Lab. So for those who don't know, Cold Spring Harbor Lab is a very world-renowned research institute on the North Shore of Long Island in New York, focusing on research, but it also has this much, much longer history of research, dissemination, and discussion. About 8,000 people come through Cold Spring Harbor every year to go to meetings, to take courses, etc. There's been some very important lab manuals in molecular biology, the Cold Spring Harbor Symposium. So it's really pretty well understood as a research institute, but a kind of hub for scientific communication within the molecular biology, genetics, and neuroscience community. So I think it's a really important fact of the history of bioRxiv and medRxiv that they were started at Cold Spring Harbor. And I think that meant a number of things. Because it was a trusted research institution, I think a lot of people were enthusiastic about preprints and the motivations in a way that they probably hadn't been with other initiatives before then. It's embedded within the academic community, is not a for-profit publishing organization, it's not a startup, it's not one of these ambiguous things that you can't quite figure out who's behind it and why. It's pretty obviously coming out of the academic community. Plus, of course, there's this history of communication expertise. So I think there was some confidence that things would be done right. And then there's the scientific network effects that stem from all those thousands of people coming through Cold Spring Harbor and spreading the word. And I think that played a huge part in the success of bioRxiv. And then subsequently the drive to launch medRxiv. So that takes us to now. 12 years later, after launch of bioRxiv, we've posted more than 1/3 preprints across bioRxiv and medRxiv, which is pretty significant, given that there were a lot of voices 12 years ago that said this would never work. Lots of people are reading those preprints. There's 10 million views per month across bioRxiv and medRxiv. That's been pretty consistent for a while, since the pandemic. And more than 80% of those papers go on to be published in journals. So it really is the same kind of content that we're seeing in the journal world. It's not like a parallel universe of kind of spurious, nonsensical, and pseudoscientific findings. A more qualitative view, if we look at it over that 12 years, there's evidently far more biologists posting, reading, citing preprints. We probably need to convert some of the people who are just reading them to also posting. But I think that's undeniable. 12 years ago, it was a worry about whether or not journals would take preprints if they were on bioRxiv. I think that's basically vanished now. If you go to that Wikipedia page that says journal and publisher policies, it used to have lots of red indicating it was really dangerous if you wanted to submit to Cell, for example. Now that whole page is pretty much green. Certainly in the basic sciences, there's almost no journal one can think of that won't take a paper that's previously appeared on a preprint server. Funders have got into the game, been encouraging and mandating preprints, Aligning Science across Parkinson's, Michael J. Fox Foundation, CZI, and now Gates are all mandating posting preprints by their grantees, and other funders like Wellcome and HHMI encourage it. And we've seen this Wellcome initiative from a number of institutions encouraging people to include preprints in grant applications, tenure packages, etc., so that the recent work that scientists are doing can be part of the evaluation, and hopefully that will encourage a drift away from this sort of horrific practice of using journal names as quality proxies, which sort of pervades the assessment system in many countries. So I think when I go back to those original goals, can we speed up science? This, I mean, that back of envelope calculation I showed from Steve was just that, a back of envelope calculation with a lot of hypotheticals and assumptions. Then, probably in the last 10 years, there'd been a lot of hand waving by people like me saying, oh, this will speed up science, and anecdotal examples. But I think we really did see this during COVID. Across bioRxiv and medRxiv, we had 30,000 COVID papers, right from the beginning, with all those early epidemiological observations coming out of China, through to the structure and molecular biology of the spike, the appearance of the different viral variants, and the effectiveness of the vaccines. And of course, along the way, things like the recovery trial showing the efficacy of dexamethasone as a treatment for severe COVID, which is really important, because I think that really did demonstrate the tangible benefits immediately. And as one medRxiv user commented, as a consequence of this today, there are people who are alive today who wouldn't have been. So, and I think if anything, that's probably the best advertisement for preprints. And a number of people who work on SARS-CoV-2 have commented that they really cannot imagine how the scientific process would have moved so fast during COVID if it hadn't been for dissemination of key papers through preprints. So the other goal, as I said, was encouraging evolution. I think we've seen that. We're seeing decoupled peer review initiatives like Peer Community in, Review Commons, etc., which couldn't really exist without preprints. So that goal has been met. Experiments with teaching people on peer review, pre-review, the evolution of journal clubs to become preprint clubs, preprint news and views initiatives like Prelights. I think you wrote one, Johnny, if I remember, a while ago, and layering the beginnings of being able to layer trust signals over preprints with another sort of, with other third parties like DataSeer, Dryad, and SciScore, providing services that can be layered on top of the preprint, but are independent of bioRxiv. I think it's important. I think everybody on this call will know this, but it's important to think of this in terms of the first step in the evolution of an article. You have versioning on preprints. That really wasn't something you saw in the journal world. You can revise a preprint and you can keep doing it as long as you want, really. And just to note, for a number of people who don't seem to realize this, probably because we're not doing a great job of getting the information out there, but you can follow preprints. So there are updates when they have comments, when they have peer reviews, when there are new versions. So I would encourage people to use that functionality. And then we introduced the dashboard on bioRxiv there, shown on the bottom right, to point readers to additional commentary, evaluation, and all these kinds of initiatives that are coming out as a consequence of decoupling of the dissemination from the evaluation. So this is just one example. I think everybody will be familiar with that. If a paper has been peer reviewed by an organization like eLife, then the peer reviews will appear in a hypothesis window alongside the paper on bioRxiv. So if you go in whatever it is, like sort of 2 or 3 months' time, you'll see the peer reviews from eLife and the evaluation alongside the author's article. And the key thing there is it's still decoupled. That hypothesis window, for those of you who don't know, hypothesis is a web annotation technology that is controlled by eLife. It's independent of bioRxiv, so that decoupling is preserved, but you can still see the peer reviews alongside the paper. So it doesn't look like they're decoupled. The same with other trust signals beyond peer review. So we've been working with SciScore, with Martijn and Anita, to link extraction of RRIDs from papers to show these alongside the bioRxiv paper, so you can see all the reagents. And again, you have further trust in the information because these are verified in a way that simply wasn't the case from just mentioning this in the preprint. So how do we go forward? What does this mean for the future? I think it's put us in a position where we can really talk about Plan U in a serious way and consider that I think preprints should be the primary means of dissemination of articles. And if we can get to that point, then everything else follows. all that evolution that I talked about should follow. We can get to better forms of peer review, better forms of information verification. That's critically dependent on everybody posting preprints. That was the goal of Plan U, was to make funder mandates a thing. But I think, we're getting to a point where really that could happen. And we have seen, for example, Gates following along CZI, ASAP, and Michael J. Fox Foundation, and hopefully there will be more funders to come. Another goal, of course, is growth. I mean, I show the top two images here really because there's been a bit of a narrative recently that preprints have stalled and that they were just a thing from the pandemic. But actually, if you look at the red bars in the top left, you'll see bioRxiv submissions continue to go up month on month. They're still going up, perhaps not as steep as they were in 2016, 2017, but last month was another record for bioRxiv of just over 4,000 submissions. If you look at medRxiv, there was a much bigger spike during the pandemic. It was a much younger server, so that the y-axis is different. But if you look at the bottom right and you extract out the non-COVID papers, you'll see that you've got the same kind of growth. And actually that looks pretty similar to what bioRxiv looked like in 2013 through 2017. So there's growth across both the clinical and the basic science. But then we have to get real about this and understand what the real challenge is. And this is the data that I just got from Johnny recently, bottom left, that ASAP Bio produced, showing the percentage of so the numbers of articles that are preprints compared with journals. So there's a long way to go, whatever that is. It's around 15%. So I think, that's the real goal now for growth, is to make that red line curve up steeply to join the black line. And that's when we'll have, preprints being the norm. Evolution, I think evolution is happening, but we want to encourage directed evolution of this system. So it's great to have everything on a preprint server, but the idea was to decouple dissemination of evaluation to improve verification and peer review. And so I think the vision that we have is that ideally everybody posts their paper on a community preprint server, and then a number of different things can happen depending on the work, depending on the author, depending on the field. Traditional peer review, decoupled peer review services like PCI or Review Commons, or other things that maybe don't look like traditional peer review. Maybe commenting is enough for some papers. Maybe badging services can verify key information. So there's space for evolution, and you have an open downstream ecosystem that improves that evaluation process. But there is another possible future, which is that the papers are preprints, but end up in silos controlled by publishers, in which all that happens is you submit a preprint to a commercial publisher, and they decide where it fits in a hierarchy of journals they have. And the danger there, of course, is it preserves the publisher hegemony, but it also preserves this toxic dependence on journal name as proxy. So I think, our view is that A rather than B is the way when we want to go in this evolutionary space, and get to ultimately this concept of the article of the future, which is part of a web of linked objects, which are linked to data in appropriate repositories, any necessary pre-registration, for example, at Center for Open Science, links out to citations, replications, verification events, and peer review, and however that evolves, and encourage a better linking between all these events, so that network is mapped and it's easy to discover things along those edges. There are a lot of challenges to doing all this. Scaling is a challenge. I mean, 4,000 or 5,000 papers. I mean, I'm looking here because this is my colleague Sam who has to deal with this, but 5,000 submissions a month, hundreds per day when you include revisions, and we have to handle all of those. How do we do that? How do we handle an order of magnitude change, which is what the aspiration is? How do we do this for screening? Every paper that you see on bioRxiv and medRxiv is looked at by an admin and someone with a PhD, a qualified scientist. That becomes harder when you have hundreds of papers per day. Who's going to do that screening? How are we going to do it? All of this costs money. It all costs more money than people think. It's much less than journals, but it's not zero. So we need funding. There are ethical challenges. All of this takes time. It will surprise no one to learn that authors fight. We get involved in those fights, and people make demands of us. That all takes staff time. If you have 10 times more papers, you have 10 times more people fighting, and you have to deal with those. It gets even worse when fraud sort of rears its ugly head. Paper mills, AI generated papers are real challenge. It's probably going to get worse. So we need to be thinking about how we're going to do that. And this is all amid a rather concerning political landscape where there may be that we're already seeing misses from attorney generals, etc., on what people who disseminate science should or shouldn't be doing. So one has to be aware of that in the background. So how are we going to do that? Well, OpenRxiv is the answer, really. So OpenRxiv, the first thing to stress, is not a preprint server. OpenRxiv is an organization that is being set up to run bioRxiv, medRxiv, and associated projects. It's a 501c3 nonprofit corporation registered in California, and the idea is that it will be independent and it will run the preprint servers. This has a number of benefits. The main one being it's independent, so its dedicated mission is entirely bioRxiv and medRxiv. So there's no, there was always concerns with the parent organization that the goals of the parent organization and the goals of the child may begin to diverge. That doesn't happen if you set up a dedicated organization, and that's what OpenRxiv is. The aim is that through that we'll be able to achieve long-term funding, stable business models, and long-term stability, so that everybody can have the confidence that in another 12 years' time, bioRxiv and medRxiv will still be here and will be even healthier than they are now. And something that's more community-based, involving a broader section of the scientific community in running these critical servers, which have moved. I think this is the point I'm making. I started by saying bioRxiv and medRxiv were an experiment. I think really the conclusion is the experiment has been successful. And so, how do you move from something that's more like a prototype to something that's operational for the long term? So, in terms of involving the broader scientific community and ensuring that the servers are steered in the right direction, we've struck a balance of continuity and bringing in very, very well-respected figures from the scientific community. So John, my co-founder, John Ingalls, and I are still going to be involved. I'm going to be the Chief Science and Strategy Officer of the new organization. John is the chair of the Science and Medical Advisory Board. Theo Bloom, who was one of our co-founders from medRxiv, is deputy chair of that Science and Medical Advisory Board. On that, Joseph Ross, who is another co-founder of medRxiv, also serves on that. And Harlan Krumholtz, who was the other Yale founder of medRxiv, is on the board of directors of OpenRxiv. And so we've got a fantastic board there. It's chaired by Scott Fraser from UCSD and CZI. People will recognize names like Edith Hurd, who's the incoming director of the CRIC in the UK, Bruce Stillman, who's president of Cold Spring Harbor. So a number of familiar faces. And then within the Science and Medical Advisory Board, I think this group will recognize people like Daniel MacArthur, who's from Australia, who was at the Broad and before that Cambridge, but he was a very enthusiastic advocate of preprints within the biological sciences community. I mean, when we first in 2012 had a meeting about setting up bioRxiv, it being a possibility, Daniel was at that meeting. So he's been there from the start. People like Neeli Bala, many people will know from the ASAP Bio community, has been a big advocate of preprints within the cell biology community from the very early days. Javier works a lot with us at medRxiv and has been incredibly helpful in guiding those operations for many years now. Again, other familiars like Leslie Vossel from HHMI, who's was on the launch advisory board for bioRxiv, as was Fiona Watt, who's now head of EMBO. So, a lot of figures who are very familiar with the scientific community and have its interests at heart. And within the executive, we're expanding. Tracy Teal has come in as interim COO, who's amazing and really helping us with the transition to OpenRxiv. And we're in the process of recruiting a CEO for the organization who will be tasked with, ensuring that it runs effectively. One thing that everybody should be reassured by is that there is that continuity. It is a new organization. It has a new structure, but the same people behind it, the same content team will be in the background. So Sam Hindle, who runs the content team, is on this call, and her team of Emma Solalaya Sanchari and Martina is still the same people. So for most users, bioRxiv and medRxiv will be the same experience, and I think that's important. And we're still backed by Kevin, John, Marisol, Ted, and Josh, providing amazing technical support, and Barb, Joanna, and Dorothy, who run a lot of the author services, because there's a lot of communication. Again, it's one of these things that goes on in the background, and I think a lot of people don't realize there's a huge amount of interaction with authors who are having problems with their papers, don't know how to submit, have queries. And so a lot of this goes on in the background, and it's critical that all these people continue to be involved to preserve that continuity. And then the other thing that will continue is the collaborational approach. One of the things that has been so rewarding about working at bioRxiv and medRxiv is the way we've managed to work with a number of different groups. We've had, obviously Cold Spring Harbor is the main one, because this is where it was initiated, and Bruce Stillman, the president, has been such a strong supporter from the outset. But the folks, Scott, Carly, and Dario at CZI have been great in supporting us, not just by writing checks, but also providing sort of moral and real support in terms of help with ideas and directions going forward. Obviously, the Sergey Brin Family Foundation have come in and given us money, which is fantastic. HHMI, Michelle Bowden and Leslie have supported us in a number of different ways. Leslie, as I said, right from the outset, great collaborations with Google, Hypothesis, our technical partners, MPS, Nova TechSet. And then, these third-party initiatives we work with, like ScienceScore, ScienceCast, who do our AI summaries, and then the broader community and scholarly communications. We have a monthly call with all the folk at Archive. That's been strongly coordinated right from the outset. Paul Ginsberg, the founder of Archive, was on the founding advisory board for bioRxiv, and we continue to have regular calls with Stein, Stephanie, and Ramin. Great collaborations with Ploss, Alison, and Veronique, and Tom Aburn and Fiona at Embo, and of course this long and ongoing relationship with eLife, who really pioneered this sort of decoupled peer review that I showed earlier. And so a lot of fruitful collaborations with Andy, Damien, and Paul. And then finally, Johnny, Katie, and of course I feel like I should mention Jessica as well. She's not listed there, but she was a big part of drawing attention to bioRxiv and our mission through the years, as Johnny and Katie are doing now. So that's really all I have to say, but I'm happy to take any questions in as much as I can answer them. And as I said, my colleague Sam is here, as is Ted. So if you have, undoubtedly there'll be questions that I don't know the answers to, but they probably will.
Thank you. Anyone who does have questions, feel free to throw them in the chat and I will try and get to them. If I can't, I'm sure Sam and Ted will jump on them. Or raise your hands and we can ask questions as well. Before we do that, because I have the power right now, I just want to thank you for actually those last few slides where you highlighted all the people involved. I think it's one of those things that often goes missed when we think about these kind of things, and just how important it is to have the right people in these kind of places and doing all that amazing work behind the scenes. Question I do have though. So one of the things I get asked quite often is about what the future of preprints looks like. And this is actually kind of related to the question that was first dropped in the chat there. And now I know you don't like to necessarily predict the future too much, but one of the things I've been hearing a lot lately, really a lot in the past few months, is this idea of when we get there, when preprints are just the standard thing, are we then going to see all the problems we currently have with the system? So, as the question in the chat is, as we scale, do you think there's going to be a bigger chance of misappropriation? Maybe that's by for-profit publishers or preprint servers in that kind of vein. Do you see preprints losing their vigor in that scenario? Where do you see the future going?
Well, I mean, that's kind of one of the reasons I did paint that kind of directed evolution picture. And for those of you who might not have seen that, I was asked by PLOS to write a sort of past, present, and future of scientific publishing, and that's in that article. And there's much sort of greater discussion of that there. So, I mean, it is a concern, but I think I think it's important to understand where some of these pressures come from. So, this whole issue of journal names, for example, I think the academic community needs to take a long, hard look at itself, because the reason that happens is a manifestation of the prestige economy. And so, there's now an opportunity for the physician to heal thyself, but it's up to the physician to take that opportunity. So I think, that point about the open ecosystem means you can do this. On the other hand, if you continue to seek easy quality proxies, then you also come to them again. So, and that's hard for the preprint ecosystem to change. I mean, what I would say is that we now have a situation where lots and lots of people are being evaluated on work that has no quality signal. So people are submitting job applications to places like Rockefeller, and they're saying, this is my preprint on bioRxiv. It's not a science paper. It's not a cell paper. It's not, and people are making hiring decisions based on that. HHMI are renewing their investigators based on papers which don't have journal names. And more importantly, it's not that the journal names have actually been scrubbed, because they haven't yet been in a journal. So, I mean, I was talking to my friend Andy Dillon at Berkeley the other day. He just came up for renewal, and he said, most of his papers were on bioRxiv. So it wasn't a question of people sort of trying to pretend they didn't know the paper was in Cell. They didn't. So we can do it. We can do it. But the academic community needs to understand why that happens, because the journals are doing it because they can. And the driving force is academic assessment. So if you want lazy quality proxies, there's always going to be somebody who's going to come in and give you a quality proxy so you can be lazy. So I think that's but I mean, as I said, I always point to HHMI in this respect, because they, if you can do it for people like that, if you can do it for all the people who've lived and breathed cell for their careers, then you can do it for anyone.
So just to build on that, another conversation I've had a lot lately. How do you see that working for the global south and sort of that bigger global picture? Because one of the biggest, I want to say complaints, people have been quite angry about it, is that all these kind of innovations are coming from a very much of a Western viewpoint. And one of the things I've heard, for example, is this idea that there's a open science conspiracy going on, because we're coming up with these ideas and saying, well, you are now going to do it like we do it. How do you see involving the global community in these kind of decisions and change?
Well, yeah, so it's interesting. It's interesting in that respect. I mean, we noticed with medRxiv that very, very quickly there was a very broad geographic distribution of submissions. And you look at some of the work that people like Cielo have been doing in South America. So I think actually there's a lot of potential there. The worry is that people begin to resort to the same kind of quality proxies that have been such a problem in in Europe in particular, and the United States. But I think if we can get away from those quality proxies, the whole notion of bioRxiv and medRxiv is they're there to serve the global scientific community, and they're not making sort of inclusion decisions based on poor proxies. So that everybody's seen the kind of the data where if you change the names of submitting authors, then the probability of the paper being accepted in a journal goes down. Of course, that doesn't happen with the preprint server. So I think there is there's a real opportunity for equity at that level, just by the very existence of preprint servers, and they're not making these kind of inclusion decisions, which are all too easily drift into biases.
Yeah, my eyes have been opened by some of the things people do to reduce things down to numbers for hiring people. So there's a question about incremental pre-printing in the chat. Um, this idea that we could have this very bare bones version of a preprint, and then you build on that as your story progresses. So you start from basically the idea, and then you could add the next version would be the experiments and some data, and then maybe you keep building it up. What are your thoughts on people accepting that sort of bare bones preprint or versioning in general? Let me open that question up. Because we've tried to look at this and we find incremental preprints are not used that much at the moment. Most preprints exist as one version, then two versions, and then after that, it really does tail off. How do you think we could get more people to version their work and think more in that kind of mindset rather than I'm going to put my preprint up and then I'm going to send it to a journal?
Yeah, well, I think there's a balance you have to strike. And Sam will probably be smiling here because we were dealing with a paper the other day where it was like this person, it was like version 33 of the paper. And, part of me, my response in that is like, this is not a Word file or a Google Doc, So I think there's a balance to strike, because you have to remember, of course, that one of the reasons you're disseminating this work is that so it can be consumed probably by a person, maybe by a machine. And they may not want to read 20 different versions of your paper. They may want to read it when they think it's worth it. I mean, we have the version notes. So it's one of the debates, there is this idea that that's very common, comes up periodically about, all papers should be living articles. And what's interesting to me is I find that proposal seems to appeal to a huge number of people in the scientific communication space. It appeals to almost no actual scientist that I have ever met. And so I think there's a balance there. I think there's one thing to have like registration of a document on open science framework for work that warrants that, and then a paper with some data, and then a paper where some other things have happened. I'm not sure we need 12 different versions which start with maybe I'm thinking about this idea. So I think you need to think about that. And maybe there will be different scenarios where, like I said, with pre-registration really does work for some things, but I don't think it works for everything. I don't think we should force everybody into this kind of like 12-step process through to article. And the other thing is that, on the whole living article, most people feel at some point, partly due to the nature of the career structure, that they want to draw a line under a project. It's not like they're going to keep doing this, but that is rather different from saying I've done this. Oh, actually, I've done something else. And there was always been a problem in the journal world and in PubMed world that you couldn't do addenda. And I think that's important. But I would distinguish. I think there's a happy medium there, and I think it would be a little naive of us to have this kind of like vision of an article, which is just like this living document constantly added to, because I just don't think many people want to read it. That might be different when it comes to machine readers, but then maybe you're more talking about the data than the narrative. So I think we just need to be a little cautious. And I think you said you started by, you probably heard me talking to other people about being wary of being a futurist. But I am a bit wary of that, because I do feel like there's some of these ideas that come up time and time again, and it feels like there's a good reason that they're not adopted because actual people doing science don't want to.
Yeah, you've hit on a really big frustration for me at the moment, is that I think there is a really bad disconnect between some people who are advocating for things and the actual researchers who are they're just not going to do it. They don't want the thing being advocated for. This is a question about the future again. So is there a future in which we don't have journals at all, but we have something like bioRxiv with that sort of layer on top of it of reviews and like that's kind of the question. I
Well,
mean,
yeah. I guess there is. I guess there is. But I mean, I remember so Mike Eisen used to have a slide which I really liked where he talked about the different types of reader. When you're encountering an article, there's somebody who wants to read an article and they want to know if it's right, and they may or may not be able to make that decision for themselves. Then there's another type of reader who is approaching something and saying, should I even read this in the first place? That's a different type of reader. And then there's the third type of reader, which is, I don't want to read this paper at all, but I need to know whether it's any good. So the question is, and what's happened is the journal world has kind of conflated all these things. So you have a Cell paper and it's like, okay, well, it's in Cell, so I must read it. It's in Cell, so I know it's good. And that will serve even whether or not I'm going to read it. So the question is, in a post, people really need those three things, right? So the question is if there's a world where journals go away, how are those three things provided? And there is a possible world in which there are, I mean, I always kind of find this as quite, there's a possible world in which all the journals go away. You have self-organizing groups of people who provide those services and say, these are the papers that you want to read. These are the ones that we think are good. And, I'm going to set up the self-organizing group and we're going to call it like the Journal of Cell Biology. And they end up basically reinventing things that journals do, but just for in a post-web environment. So, I think we'll see, but it's hard for me to get away from the idea that people are going to want proxies and people are going to want filters that tell them what's the good stuff. And they may end up looking like, I mean, I once joked with Phil Campbell when he was editor of Nature that, would we move into a world where rather than it published in Nature, it was highlighted in Nature? And somebody once said people would kill their grandmother to have a news and views of their article. And that's basically the same motivation as wanting to have a citation that says Nature, isn't it? So, but it's back to that whole point about quality proxies. You have to understand there's this drive, and to deny it would be naive, because if you deny it, then it's going to happen anyway, and you're not going to be able to control how it happens.
Yeah. So that question also touches on the commenting section, which is another thing I was talking about this week with our fellows, actually. Do you have any sense how often comments are read by readers? Because I know generally people don't post comments, they give feedback privately, or at least that was 2019. I don't know if that's changed since. But I have no sense about how often comments are read.
I don't know. Well, I mean, we always joke it depends whether or not the paper's about vaccines. Because then you get tons of comments and you got lots of interaction. I suspect not very much. I mean, I think we're also a little bit deluded about how often the peer reviews are read, whether that matters or not. I mean, I've had arguments with Bernd about the numbers they have from EMBO about, I think he said something like, 15% of papers people read the review articles, read the peer reviews. And I told him I didn't believe that, because I don't even believe that 15% of people are reading any content in the paper. But, yeah, it's a difficult one. Sam, I don't know if you oversaw the survey that we did recently, and that Johnny's point about in 2019 most people getting private feedback was true. I think that was true in the more recent survey. Do you remember?
Yeah, I think generally speaking that is still the case, that a lot of it's private. But we have seen from that survey that I think around just over 60% of authors who answered the survey were receiving feedback in some form. And for the people who are actually motivated to post preprints because they want feedback, I think it was about 70 odd percent of those people who were actually getting some feedback. So I think there has been a shift in the amount of feedback that we're seeing. It's not publicly posted. And what's another nice thing that we found from our analyses is over the past 5 years, as Richard was saying, there's a lot of other like overlay type projects and initiatives, and we're seeing a lot more reviews being provided through those means. So whether that's community reviewing or through journal initiatives, and that with the community reviewing, we're also seeing that there's a increase in the speed in which those reviews are being posted, which makes it even more helpful for authors to incorporate that before they might choose to submit to a journal. And one other little point from our survey is that we asked how soon authors are submitting their manuscripts, and we were a little bit more granular with our survey from last year than we were in 2019. And we were surprised to see that I think more than 10% of those of authors who answered the survey are actually posting their preprint more than a month before they submit to a journal. So I think that's something, to your point, Johnny, about the bare bones versions. I feel like it's more important to be trying to advocate for just earlier submission of the manuscript once you're happy with it, rather than what's in the manuscript and then building on it. Just as soon as you're happy with it, get it out there, and then allow people to build on that and give you feedback and help you improve the work. So
yeah, I'm really looking forward to that updated survey data. If anyone who wants to know the best time to post a preprint, I have started to look at that, and it looks like about a month before you submit to a journal is probably the best time for sort of benefits and payoff. I'm also looking at whether or not all these extra overlay services have any impact on your preprint reading and downloading and citing and stuff. So that hopefully will come at some point in the distant future. Another futuristic question. Everyone wants people with glass balls. How do you see the future of modular publishing? So this is kind of what Octopus are trying to do. Do you foresee bioRxiv publishing modular pieces in the future?
I mean, I think it's kind of a bit like the other answer, but it's a different access. I mean, I mean, what I think what we would encourage people to do is post a report of the thing they're doing, and then if they do some other stuff that's sufficiently related, that's version 2 of a paper. If it's sufficiently different, then they can post a new paper. Again, it's a bit like the whole. I mean, I'm always slightly confused because when people talk about nano publications and micro publications, they tend to be thinking about different things. I've definitely had people say, oh, can you put micro publications on bioRxiv? And then I say, well, what's a micro publication? And they say, well, it's basically like one experiment. And I say, well, does it have methods? And they say yes, and results and discussion, yes. And I'm like, well, okay, well, that's just a very short paper. So I worry that some of this we're overthinking a little bit. I mean, I think, like I said, pre-registration makes a huge amount of sense in some disciplines. And so, the work the Center for Open Science is doing is fantastic. Having independent protocols that can be independently cited makes sense. But sometimes you're doing about 5 different techniques, and it just makes sense to have those as references. You can have data publications and data sets that are kind of standalone, but I guess I'm just not convinced that, I mean, maybe just because I'm sort of by experience a molecular biologist, that if I did 5 Western blots and some RNA-seq, that it was really that helpful for me to have 5 different outputs of those that I later combine. But I think, so I think there's sort of horses for courses, and I'm a little bit wary about some of these proposals, which I'm not sure necessarily map to the way that everybody works.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that as well. Okay, bring it back to current things. One thing I find with the open access discussions is a lot of these are really focused on diamond open access, and I often see green and preprints being sort of left out of those discussions. That might just be my biased view of things. What can we do to shift that a bit and to really get preprints part of those discussions more and as a bigger part of that? Because that annoys me at the moment.
Well, I mean, I feel bad because I know that Michelle is on this call, but it's like shout at funders, basically. I mean, we know this from, I mean, this is not necessarily just to do with preprints, but we know with PubMed Central that when people had to kind of like voluntarily do it, they didn't. And then when NIH had the public access mandate and when Wellcome, etc., mandated, then suddenly compliance went up. People will do things like this. It's the whole kind of, how do you herd cats? You move the food. How do you get scientists to do what you want? You have funders make it a condition of getting money. I mean, I remember talking with the folk at CZI about the BioHub in San Francisco when they came up with a policy saying you have to post preprints. And they said, well, half the people said, we're doing it already. 45% we said, well, we hadn't, now we'll do it. And one person said, okay, well, I'm not going to, I don't want to post a preprint. And they said, well, you won't get the money. And then they did, so I think that's kind of the stick that you have. But I think as the point that Mike and John and I made in that Plan U article is that it's an $8 billion industry, and it's really hard to manipulate that. But preprints allow you, if your goal is to make the information free, to completely circumvent all that. And I think and maybe Gates have understood this now, but really understand that, if your funder, if you're saying, I'm funding something and my goal is to get the work out for free, how do I get it? Then you say mandate posting a preprint. And then if you want to discuss how the work is evaluated, that's a whole separate conversation. Whether or not you want to destroy the corporate publishing industry, that's whole, have at it. But if the goal is getting the open access goal was to have the information be free, so just make that be free, and then you can still do all the other stuff, but you can do it in different ways. So I think that's the point one really has to ram home, is that decoupling not only creates that evolutionary space, but it also creates separate decision making, and it allows you to solve this one. And I was going up. It allows us to solve this one problem that we've been fighting about since the late 90s, and really hasn't been solved. And the only sort of solution proposed, gold, is people seem to have as many problems with the solution as they did with the original problem. So I think that's really the way to go. But if funders and institutions can increasingly show that a preprint is fine, in the way that HHMI have done, in the way that people who are saying we're hiring based on this will do, then that should change things. But I think the problem with Diamond Open Access is it's hard for me to see how you have an $8 billion industry that's Diamond. Preprints, you can do it with preprints because it's 2 orders of magnitude less. That's it's whatever it is, $5,000 for a journal article, tens of dollars for a bioRxiv article. It's chump change. It's money behind the sofa to do that for preprints. It's a much harder conversation when you think of funding journals, if you want them to look like they do now. And that's why I always go back to the EMBO numbers. If you look at what EMBO do for a paper, non-profit, you can't accuse them of being some kind of fleecing corporate publisher, but that is something like 14 hours of staff time behind every paper. That costs money. And there's lots of hours of staff time behind all the papers you reject. So you have to think about that. You have to think about, either we're not going to do this, that's fine, or we're going to do it and we have to fund it somehow. And you can't say we're going to have a system like we do. It's just all going to be free and Diamond. I don't think that works, because I just don't think we're going to find $8 billion. And even if you get rid of all the profits, so cut it down to 5 billion because you get rid of the 30%. So we're just talking about costs rather than profits. It's still a number that's hard to do. And back to your point about the Global South, there are really inequitous ways that this could work, where suddenly you have a system where it's all free for people who have big funding agencies, but all the people who don't and are in the Global South end up having to pay APCs. That would be a really terrible place to get to.
Yeah, I've had a lot of anger directed at me, as if it's my fault for APCs in general. I think I'm just someone who will listen to people vent on it, and it is actual real anger. And I think a lot of the people behind these decisions would do well to be in part of some of those conversations and hear just how upset people from the Global South are, who have to basically beg sometimes to actually publish their work, and it's far from equality.
The other thing to be aware of in those scenarios is that even if you start having waivers, you could waive it for the Global South, but then when you move into disciplinary work, the challenge with that approach is, do you say, if you suddenly find that all the historians and all the English majors cannot afford APCs because they don't have grants, like all the mathematicians don't have grants, do you then say, well, every paper that's a welcome funded paper is actually, rather, it's not 30% service charge for the profits of Springer Nature, it's 30% because we have to cover the costs for all the other disciplines that can't afford APCs. So there's things like that make it really difficult.
Yeah. The waivers also, lots of things to be said about the waivers and how they don't work actually as well. Anyway, we are at the hour, so I will not keep you longer than that. Thank you so much for a really, really interesting session. There are questions in the chat. Well, there's not that many questions in the chat, but I think we've gotten to them all. This will be up on YouTube sort of late tomorrow afternoon. But yeah, thank you so much, Richard. And hopefully, Sam, we will have you back when all that data is in a nice written up narrative format to talk about that as well. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Johnny.